Thank you all so much for tuning in to the National LGBT Bar's first webcast in the series Life at the Crossroads, Navigating Intersectional Identities as a Law Student. The goal of this series is to provide a platform and a resource for law students across the country that'll support and stimulate open and honest dialogue surrounding LGBTQ plus intersectional identities and the impact that they have on our law school experience. The National LGBT Bar would like to thank the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association's LGBTQ plus group for assisting in the production of today's webcast. My name is Taylor Carter-Disanto, pronouns she, her, and I am a fellow here at the National LGBT Bar. I am also a 2020 law school graduate and served as co-chair of the Bar's Law Student Congress for the 2019 to 2020 school year. Today, I have the privilege of introducing our wonderful moderator, Chee. Heaven is an associate at Yetter Coleman LLP, where her practice focuses mainly on high-stakes commercial litigation and appeals. She's a 2013 graduate of the University of Virginia Law School and an active member of NAPABA's LGBTQ plus group. Heaven will be guiding today's panel discussion, so I'm gonna shut my camera off and turn it over to Heaven for the remainder of the webcast. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Taylor. It's really great to be here, and I'm so pleased to be joined by 5 law students from across the country who vary in both class year, in background, and gender identity. It's a real honor to be here to facilitate this conversation. It's something that I really wish existed back when I was in law school, way back in the dark ages, a decade ago. So I would love to have all of our participants introduce themselves so that we can hear from them on where they go to school or what area of the country they're living in, and also, to start us off, why they first wanted to go to law school. So without further ado, AK, if you could lead us off and introduce yourself, we'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everyone. My name is AK Chee. My pronouns are both they, them, and he, him. I identify as a trans person of color. I'm Chinese and Taiwanese. My parents both immigrated here in the 80s, but I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I'm currently still in LA. I'm a 3L at UCLA School of Law. I took 6 years off before law school because I didn't really think that law was an option for me, but ultimately I did decide to take on the law school application process, mostly because I did a lot of work within the arts and nonprofit programs. And while I think those things are really, really important, I personally found that the arts more conceptually uplifted and inspired people. And in my own pivot to the law, I wanted to be more of a practical resource to my community, both in terms of navigating the rules that govern our lives and in terms of financial support. So I'm happy to be here today and to hear what everyone else has to say.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chee. My pronouns are he, him. I identify as gay and queer, and I'm a 1L part-time evening program student at CUNY Law School in New York City. I am half Asian, half white. My dad immigrated from Thailand to Oklahoma, where he met my mother. Her parents are from Ireland. I grew up there. But I decided to go to law school because I have a community organizing background and started to do a lot of policy work and legislative advocacy. And I just realized quickly how powerful it would be to have a law degree to ultimately create more social change.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Ellen Miller. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a chaotic bisexual. And so I'm half Chinese, half white. I grew up in an immigrant household. My mom came over in 1989 after Tiananmen, and then I was raised also by my grandparents who didn't speak any English. So I am a 3L at Boston University School of Law, and I went to law school for a couple quick reasons. I think first, I graduated, shortly after the 2016 election, and the desire to be able to actually do something about systemic oppression was a big motivating factor. I think also I graduated with a fine arts degree, was doing a gap year Fulbright in Taiwan, and just was feeling kind of lost. But for me, there were parallels between the translation and the interpreting I'd done as a child and getting a law degree. I think a lot of the skills were the same. So that's what brought me here.
Hi everyone, my name is Gregory Ha. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am currently a 2L at Fordham University in New York City. I'm basically generation 2.5 in terms of immigration. My father, he was born in New York City. My mother immigrated from China, Hong Kong, that area. So we're Cantonese, Toisanese. As for why I went to law school, like AK, I took some time off, a lot of time off after college. I actually lived in Taiwan for most of that time. And it was mostly because I didn't enjoy the racism that I was experiencing in New York City at that time. So like maybe about 10 years later, I came back to New York City as a career move, decided that I liked New York City. Everything had changed. Maybe the technology had changed. So I decided that I wanted to stay here, but not as a teacher. I tried teaching and it's not for me in the public school system. But I still want to contribute to local society, especially economic development. So I decided that law was the place for me.
Hi, my name is Maya Reddy. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm currently a 2L at Penn Law and quarantined in Philadelphia, though I am from California and will not stop talking about how homesick I am. My parents immigrated to California about in the 80s from India, and I grew up in a really small town in Northern California that is mostly famous because it's the same hometown as Megan Rapino and Kathleen Kennedy, who is the head of Lucasfilm right now. And it was I love that town. It's full of like amazing nature, and I had I wouldn't trade it for anything. And it was also very, very white and very, small POC communities. So it kind of wasn't until college really when I kind of got to know the Asian community and build an Asian community of folks that are my age and not just kind of like family friends. And yeah, so that actually kind of plays into why I went to law school. Like AK and Greg, I also took some time off between graduating college and coming to law school. In between that time, I played golf professionally and worked in the film industry for a little bit. But kind of like both of those experiences, unfortunately playing golf professionally in the ramp up to the 2016 election when you are a woman of color and a queer woman of color, it's not really the best experience. And, as much as I love the sport, I kind of endured a lot of, discrimination from all angles. And ultimately had to take a step back because it was impossible. And, I imagine similar to some of the things that Greg may have faced when he moved back to Taiwan. But kind of in that process, I ended up becoming really involved with Athlete Ally. And I've continued to work with them as a professional ambassador. But it kind of was more than that. Not only was it very kind of empowering for my own journey, but it also allowed me to be really involved with changing the culture of the sports world, as well as kind of seeing how much of an impact sports policy can have on larger social change. So between that work on policy formation and advocacy, I, much like Chee said, that it kind of really highlighted how powerful the language of the law can be in affecting even more change in that way. So I ended up coming to law school, and I'm here on my queer agenda to just keep yelling about queer stuff in sports and how it is definitely a really core aspect of our larger fight for queer equality.
Thank you all. And Maya, I think between you and Megan Rapino, you will have the coolest queer fighting in sports background in that community. So go back and make hay back there when you get home. This is the first time I'm meeting any of you, and it's really great to hear that for pretty much all of you, you're motivated to go to law school to help in some way or another, either by your own personal experiences or the community you're surrounded in, or the 2016 election, which I think as of today is finally called and resolved in our favor. Our not that the LGBT bar takes a political stance, but I do. So I'm really glad to have all of you here. And I wanted to ask, because what makes law really challenging for a lot of people who come from immigrant communities or just communities of color is that it's one of the least accessible professions in terms of just understanding the day-to-day of how it works. So you have a lot of us started with this kind of general idea of I want to help, but actually putting pen to paper for becoming a lawyer is a totally different ballgame. So I think Maya and Chai, you had experiences in your own professional lives before you got to law school. So I kind of wanted to hear from AK and Greg and Ellen about how you conceptualized law as a way to help and why that and how that has actually played out in your decision and your application process and in getting into law school. So AK, could you lead us off on that?
Yeah, so in working with different community organizations around LA and just being a part of the queer and queer POC community here, I just felt like so many people were struggling with different things like eviction things or employment things or starting their own little business but not really knowing how to like jump through all of the hoops. Just like a lot of different things that like related to the law, and also a lot of things related to actual support from people who have more of a, I guess, a foothold in like financial security. A lot of the queer POC communities here are very, it's a very supportive community, but a lot of people here are just, it's KPOC supporting other KPOC, and I wanted to like kind of break into the system where I can actually develop the tools to look over a contract or be able to like know what goes into an actual like discrimination claim, or even just like being financially secure enough to donate to all the GoFundMe's that like pass my social media pages and stuff like that. So I don't know. I just felt like law school was a way for me to kind of develop the technocratic aspects of being able to help the people that I care about. And I feel like I was fortunate enough to have access to that. I tried it out a little bit by working at a law firm for about 2 years before I actually applied to school. And while that experience, I think it was illuminating because it did in some ways affirm the kind of concerns I had about the law, where, you know, clients would treat me a little bit differently, other people would like misgender me. It was just like kind of a whole mess of things that I wasn't surprised by. But in other ways, I found a lot of support from people who I also saw doing a similar kind of work. So I think that was at once, you know, like affirming and encouraging. And ever since being a student at UCLA, I think that I do see the demographics changing. I think Ellen mentioned after the 2016 election, seems like that I think that there was a distinct Trump bump of people who do more activist work coming to law school. So I think that the fabric of my peers is very encouraging to me. So I don't know if that answered the question, but here we are.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Greg, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, so I think back in college, I've been really interested in economic development and what it means to be a community and how we make sure that we kind of see ourselves as part of the local community, because I feel like it really determines a lot of our lives, just where we live. And when I was in Taiwan, I had developed myself as a teacher, and I saw myself in that role as being someone who creates an environment who is very welcoming and helps students like see the different types of people that there are and how to interact. It's like, what are the rules of the road of just getting along with each other? And it's something that I want to continue, something that I wanted to find a way of pursuing in New York City. And that was why the law came as a path for me, because I saw it as a way to help the communities that I was concerned with, help them navigate local laws, different political forces that are going to affect their economic welfare, whether they have access to PPP. And it's just, there's so many obstacles that might get in the way. So that was something that I really wanted to kind of understand more and become involved with. by getting into the law.
Perfect. Yeah, Ellen?
So I use this metaphor of the law as a language often, and y'all will be tired of it by the end of this podcast. But I think it's true. And I think for me, like language access was a particular area of interest, metaphor aside. Like I had grown up, you know, having strangers mistake my mother for my nanny, or, you know, people asking her what agency she worked for. People talking down on her because, you know, like she was a doctor in China and she's so smart. But just watching people speak to her like she was lesser, and watching my grandparents not be able to leave the house, to drive, to do really anything, because they didn't speak any English. Like, so for me, I think that was a big motivating factor because when you don't understand systems and structures, it's very hard to change them. And it felt very personal because the year after, you know, after I graduated and I lived in Taiwan for a year, like my reading and writing is okay. At that point, it was, you know, maybe an elementary school level. And so the feeling of frustration, knowing like how smart I was, but not in Mandarin, you know, and all these things that I wanted to be able to say. So for me, I think that those skills and those interests kind of transferred that way. I think also in undergrad, I had done a lot of work around sexual assaults on campuses, and trying to understand how Title IX worked within a larger structure. I had spent some time tutoring at a women's prison, and just like seeing what my students were in jail for was infuriating because, you know, almost always it was these victimless crimes. And I think the surrounding town, because I went to school in New Jersey, the surrounding town was super white, and every single one of my students was not white. And so I think, again, they do call us the Trump bump, and I think there is truth to that. But just wanting the power and the legitimacy, like the agency to move within a system. So for me, it was very much about understanding structures of power in order to critique or change or dismantle, hopefully. And so, yeah, for me, that was really what motivated me to go.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like you were coming into law as if you were identifying a need of just, there's a language and there are structures that you guys, that the people you cared about were not able to be fluent in, and you wanted to fill that gap. So on that, on that note, I wanted to ask Chee and Maya the kind of inverse of the question, which is when you were professionals already as a policy director or as a professional athlete, you were already advocating for people. So there must have been a time where you either met someone or had a kind of light bulb moment where you realized that there was a gap, a very specific gap in what you needed to fill. And that's when you decided to go to law school. So could you tell us about what that moment was when you couldn't accomplish what you wanted to accomplish in the jobs that you were already in? Chee, can you lead us off?
Sure. So this is tough because there's I feel like there's lots of small moments. But I mean, what really stands out to me, very similar to Ellen, is when I first started doing community organizing, I got a part-time job as an organizer with an organization called the Kansas City Anti-Violence Project. And I was working with kind of within and outside of the criminal justice system with LGBTQ survivors of violence. And, you know, my own personal experiences aside, I realized just how, one, segregated the city I was working in was, and how vastly different the experiences of survivors and victims of violence who are people of color, and specifically Black people in that city, were compared to white people, and how just severe the systemic barriers were for trans women of color and for Black trans women. The first real murder case I worked on was of a Black trans woman who she was, you know, misgendered by the police, and really every meeting that I had kind of trying to support the community around that incident, just it was really eye-opening. And then working with other trans women of color at that time, many of them had criminal records, and we all kind of know the layers and layers that go on top of driving people to have criminal records, but it was really about survival. I mean, it was both police profiling for, assumptions that they were engaged in sex work, or they were actually engaged in survival sex work, because there were no laws that protected them from non-discrimination. And the systems, for example, like at that time, trying to find them places to stay was really hard, because the homeless shelter systems were, they were mostly faith-based. And so they were Christian, and they would say, you can't, if you come here, you can't wear your wig, you can't present as a woman, all these things, you have to go to church. And if you have a criminal sex conviction, which sex workers did, then you couldn't get Section 8 housing, you couldn't get on food stamps. So literally people weren't able, like, we were trying to find them just access to food and housing. And unfortunately, one of my clients was killed. And I think that just really taught me that you can't, I have a lot of respect for social work and social services. I mean, it's a critical profession, but for me, I felt like the real drive that my mind went to was, you have to change the system, and that's going to take a different kind of strategy and a different kind of tactic. So that's really, I would say, why I wanted to specifically go into like changing laws and policies.
Yeah, for me, it kind of is, I don't know, it feels like a confluence of a bunch of different reasons, but I think like many of the folks on this panel, I felt this deep frustration with the slow pace of change. And I think that community organizing is intensely valuable and a vital aspect to social change. And I mean, if it wasn't obvious by me playing professional golf, I'm like crazy competitive. So I was really, really kind of impatient with the pace that things were going. And especially in the sports world, and especially for people who are not men, it kind of making that change is much harder, because folks don't tend to pay attention to sports that are not like the NFL or the NBA. And so because of that, that culture change was just so incredibly slow moving. And I mean, yes, it's been incredible to see the work that organizations like Athlete Ally, or, athletes like Gus Kenworthy, or I mean, I guess the entire WNBA is doing right now. But within kind of my world of golf, there wasn't visibility, of marginalized identities, let alone people really kind of speaking out about equal pay, inclusion, just kind of being out there visible and proud. And I think that visibility is kind of like the first hurdle in a lot of social justice movements. And because for me, like I hadn't amassed, my success rate yet enough to have a big enough platform in order to kind of be a voice or be a part of that visibility. It kind of emphasized how slowly this change was moving, and how much I was like, I just wish I could see somebody like me out there. And yes, there's so many incredible Asian athletes on the LPGA tour who are like truly kicking ass. And there's this kind of flip side to it, where there's a lot of intense exoticization and tokenization of those athletes, who are in a lot of ways still kind of considered as other. So like, even with the it's like representation matters, and good representation matters even more. So I kind of was like stuck in this crossroads of like, okay, like I know that I could say something, and I have like, the queer theory language of undergrad to be able to say something, but I don't have the platform to do that. And would a platform have the most kind of efficacy in this way? And so when I started to see kind of, there was this case a while ago called Lawless v. LPGA, and it was brought by this trans long drive golfer who was kind of trying to play in the US Women's Open, but the LPGA's constitution at that time was only allowing participants who were born female at birth. And so just blatantly transphobic. And so Lana Lawless brought this suit, and it actually ended up changing the constitution of the LPGA to become more inclusive. And so kind of seeing that and seeing like how there is this direct correlation between the language of the law and the power of the law to actual change that can happen more immediately in some ways than representation can happen, can kind of affect, kind of was really, really inspiring to me, because I truly do not want any other person to kind of endure the discrimination that I faced. And unfortunately, with like the multitude of trans bans popping up around the United States, like that's still happening. And yet, like we have seen that, you know, the ACLUs of the world, the NCLR, Lambda Legal have been, and so many other firms have been super successful in getting not only these bans shot down, but also kind of the legal world and judges to affirm, you know, gender identities of trans individuals and yeah, it's kind of like few and far between, I think, than many of us would like it to be. But having that kind of like on the text of the law or like in legal precedent, I think is really, really important for our communities. And so kind of like that was just really, really important to me. And then also I founded this community organization called the Queer Asian Social Club a couple years ago. Oh yeah, that's me.
I'm losing my mind.
Yeah.
I follow y'all on many.
Oh, wait, that makes me so happy.
Please invite all of us, by the way. Are we allowed to? Is this invite only?
Oh my God, no, please come. Like, it's just, you'll see me like yelling about how I love kombucha most of the time, and then going on like a side rant about how the law has not been great to Asian immigrants in this country. But that was also kind of like another reason why the law appealed to me, because I was like, I think especially for Asian communities, like we have been subjugated, and like our, you know, ancestors have been subjugated by these really racist immigration laws that like are still around. You know, you look at Plessy v. Ferguson, and in the dissent that's like kind of railing, you know, like this discriminatory ruling, they're also saying that the Chinamen, quote unquote, are not allowed in this country, essentially. And so, you know, it was really important for me, like on another note, and I'm sure that many of the other folks here feel the same thing, but it's like, just by virtue of having our voices within the law, it's like we get to create like a more inclusive and affirming world. And it doesn't matter kind of like what area or what practice we go into. It's like we have Asian voices kind of involved with this structure, and that continues. I mean, like I think a lot about Kamala Harris being elected. It's like no matter what folks kind of think of her record, and I do think that, you know, we should hold folks accountable. Any person should continue to be held accountable. However, that visibility and that voice and that perspective will have a very important impact on kind of like continuing to open doors for like, you know, us sitting right here and like so many people who are going to come after us.
Yeah, that's the perfect segue into what I was going to ask you guys next. And I wanted to open it up with Ellen, but also then have all of you chime in, or anyone who would like to share chime in, because one thing that stuck out when you were introducing yourself, Ellen, was this notion that it was so frustrating to be really smart but not know how to navigate wherever you are, whether it's not knowing the English language and you're in America, even though you're a doctor in China, where it was quite possibly more competitive to become a doctor, or whether or not you're a law student who has no lawyers in the family, no lawyer friends, no lawyer mentors, and knowing that, you know, you're just kind of, you're capable of doing whatever needs to be done, but there's not a lot of guidance that you have in your inner circle. So I wanted to ask you first, and then have everyone kind of share either positive or negative experiences that you've had, either, you know, finding the right path, either through a professor or professional mentor or bar association, to help, you know, kind of you put together the practical pieces to get to the goal of why you went to law school, or any obstacles that you ran into, even though you know that you have this passion and capability. So Ellen, could you share what your experiences are?
I think for me, the hardest part about starting law school was the imposter syndrome. Like just the feeling that I was in way over my head, that like somehow me with my fine arts degree had like scammed this school into accepting me. And I think it reflected, like, I think, you know, I tried to read all these different study guides, and like I was just spending my time on not the right things and spending 12 hours a day in the library and like not knowing what I was doing. And you know, it's funny because every interview I was ever at, they look at my resume, my transcripts, and they say like, huh, like your grades got way better second semester, what changed? And for me, it was actually doing something outside of the law school. So I started volunteering with Greater Boston Legal Services Asian Outreach Unit. And so every Tuesday morning, I go downtown into Chinatown and do legal intakes in Chinese, and just like write up a problem statement, send it off. But for me, that was super, super, super tethering. It was like putting the law into context, right? Because we read all these torts cases about trains, and then you get to con law and you find out exactly who in the class thinks that you deserve to be a person. And it's just very stressful, and sometimes doesn't feel super connected to what brought you to law school in the first place. But for me, it was really like finding a way to tie law school to things that really mattered to me. That I think started making things click. And then also just knowing like it doesn't matter how you cold call. Like it doesn't. You can say the dumbest thing and it straight up does not matter. You just need to know the rule for the final exam. And so I think letting go of the fear of being outed as being stupid was also really liberating. So I think, you know, I mean, we had a lot of great faculty members and a lot of really awesome people. Like I think my best support system has been other law students, but a lot of like learning to succeed in law school was really just letting go of this feeling that I was too dumb to be here and that they were going to find out.
Yeah, that I can tell you already that is absolutely not true. You're not too dumb to be there. I'm sure you've already figured that out, but in case you haven't, don't let the haters keep you down. And I think that question is just so applicable to everyone. I'd love to hear from anyone else on it. Greg, Chai, Maya, AK, just unmute yourself, and I'd love to hear your version of it. Yeah, go for it, Greg.
So I think one thing for me was with the competition teams. My school has one for alternative dispute resolution, and I wanted to get in because I wasn't sure. I had previously worked as a paralegal, but that was in litigation, so I didn't really have any exposure to work that would be more transactional. So I thought, okay, this would be a good opportunity. And I didn't know, I think going in, I knew that there are different negotiating styles, but I didn't know exactly what they wanted. And it was something that I felt like it could have been explained to me, what they're kind of looking for, but I didn't really have anyone that I could look to who was involved with it, or someone who like actively like brought it up with me, like, oh, just so you know, this competition is coming up and this is what they're kind of looking for. So I think I kind of lost out in that. I just had like this idea of what would be a good negotiating style, and it turned out like, no, that's not what they want. And because I personally feel like I can adapt, like I learn decently, as long as I'm told like what they're kind of looking for. And I couldn't really tell whether it was something, I don't know whether it was something cultural. I don't know whether that became a factor at all. But I know that right now I'm mentoring 2 other students, and they're both Chinese and queer. So with them, I'm like really upfront, like, you want this? okay, this is what you need to do, A, B, C, D. And if you need to double check me, so go and talk to this person. And I'm just being very proactive with like the network that we're kind of building at my school, making sure that the people behind me are able to really go to places where like I couldn't access.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for that. I mean, I'm sorry to not, it's not amazing, and I'm sorry that you didn't have someone to kind of be that guiding light for you, but you identified the problem after you lived it, and you're making it better for those who came after you. So that's amazing. Thank you for doing that. And I would be curious to hear what any of the other three of you have experienced in terms of either not having that mentorship too, or finding it, or finding another outlet that's made the law and law school feel more accessible to you now that you're in it and trying to put pen to paper.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's hard because like the law and law school is very white and very straight. And so like trying to find those niches is really difficult, especially when you're at the intersection of a few identities, because it's hard to find folks who are like you. And I feel like so happy, like my heart's very warm right now being able to share space with all of you guys, because it's like these spaces where you get to find folks who are, like have that shared identities or shared passions and are kind of like also weathering the storm of law school. It feels, it helps you feel less alone. And for me, I've kind of struggled with this a lot last year, my first year. I'm in one of the public interest programs at Penn, which is really wonderful, and I'm very grateful and privileged to be a part of it. And it has felt really isolating in that many of the folks were not POC and were not queer. And I found myself having to do a lot of legwork to kind of just explain. And it was kind of more than that. It kind of got to the point where I was feeling the model minority myth like very intensely. We've been having a lot of conversations on our campus about racial justice and how the school and faculty can support and create a empowering and inclusive environment for students of marginalized identities. And within those conversations, we had a big demonstration my 1L year, and I had a conversation with a few other public interest students in which they essentially kind of like ignored or erased the fact that I was a woman of color, and kind of were talking down to me on how to advocate for students of color. I kind of had this moment where I told one of them, like, hey, what's important for allies of any type is to create space so that those that you are kind of like helping feel, empowered and feel safe to kind of like speak our truth, or safe to kind of like fight, or, whatever exist. And this person kind of came back to me and explained to me, actually, like kind of did the mansplaining of like, well, actually, this is how you do it. And that essentially, it happened early in my first semester, and it like soured my kind of perception of law school in a really intense way. And I think on the flip side, what it did make me realize is how important and how much I missed community organizing, and how, kind of trying to dip my toes back into it and continue to be involved in it was not only like really great for continuing to have community, but also to remind myself, like, why am I even in law school in the first place? And then I think also the added benefit is like, okay, just because I'm in law school doesn't mean that I know anything more than other people. It's just that I have access to this different thing. And that shouldn't, position me as like a savior in any sense. And so I found that to be incredibly valuable, especially kind of like going into the pandemic times where finding community has been that much harder. And kind of taking that experiences that I had my 1L year, I've tried to really kind of like how Greg was saying, like try to be a mentor and try to like pave ways for like people to not feel those same things. So I'm like the president of our queer organization on campus, and I spend truly the entire time screaming about POC things, and reminding folks that like we need to just, you know, like the queer experience isn't one experience, no matter what identity you are. And so to continue to hold space for that is like incredibly vital, and to work with like the other affinity groups on campus is really important for creating that environment. But it's hard because we're still having conversations about how like very recently, you know, Walter Wallace, a young Black man who was experiencing a mental health crisis, was murdered in West Philadelphia, which is the backyard of Penn Law and Penn itself. And yet none of our professors really talked about it in class. And, you know, for everybody, it was so dissonant. It was like, how are we supposed to come to class talking about this language of the law that could go a long ways into preventing this violent injustice, and then not actually kind of acknowledge what is happening like right next door. And so, you know, it's been really powerful to see kind of like, and be a part of like leadership on campus to just kind of like push back and be able to be like, hey, like we got to do this. So I think that it kind of, it sucks, but it does feel like as a marginalized, you know, like a person of a marginalized identity, there's this added responsibility when you're in a space that is not very inclusive to just at least try to lead by in whatever small example that you can. And like, even if you don't feel like doing that, it's just like, be a good person. And like, that makes a huge difference to like so many other people around you just by being nice.
And by holding the space, like you said, like just by clearing the path for people who are not, perhaps not as open or out or not as vocal, you make such a huge difference just by holding the space for what you described doing. So yeah, that is a really, like what you mentioned about the affinity groups is really interesting, because like as far as when I was at law school, and I haven't heard of a real intersectional group existing. There was like APALSA, or I think APALSA has a different name in different law schools, but the Asian affinity group, and then there's we called it Lambda, for the LGBTQ plus group. So Chai and AK, I'd be really curious what your experiences with these kind of pre-cut communities were within law school, and whether or not they were good at kind of acknowledging intersectionality and holding space for both of your identities, or if you kind of gravitated towards one or the other. I'd love to hear from you about that.
Yeah, so at UCLA, we have an APILSA group, and then we also have an Outlaw chapter, which is the umbrella LGBT student organization. I was on the board of APILSA, and I was co-chair of Outlaw, but I mean, just historically speaking, the LGBT people who tend to get access to law school are largely white. They have like different priorities, and so there was definitely a lack of kind of more intersectional support within that organization. Not that it doesn't do good things. Through our Outlaw, we did a lot of like intercommunity support. We organized protests, counter protests, did all of these different things. But up here, and I actually ended up co-founding the Queer and Trans People of Color Collective to kind of sit as a separate entity for queer and trans people of color on campus. And so it's a much smaller organization, but it's a very intentional space for people who have these like myriad identities. And so it's super cute. It's a community space. We have like potlucks. We also do like things. We like put together goodie bags. We had a game night recently, all of that. And it's just like a much more close-knit group where we understand more of each other's experiences of getting to the law and what we have to navigate when, for example, looking for professor mentorship and things like that, because it's kind of hard. It ties back to, I think, Ellen or somebody else talked about imposter syndrome, where finding someone to guide you, it's not like there are professors who are unwilling to do that because you're queer or a POC, but like that kind of connection, it just isn't as easy, where most of our professors are white. A lot of the ones who are queer are white. I mean, like UCLA has a really beefy critical race specialization program where we have a lot of CRS faculty who are great, but most of them are straight. So they don't really understand what the queer and trans people of colors, like those students go through. And not having that kind of same understanding or experience to pull from makes it a little bit more difficult to overcome like your feelings of being an imposter and not being smart enough to like take up their time for mentorship and things like that. I think that for us as a student group, we try to like Gregory mentioned, we mentor each other. And so like as a 3L, I have a lot of mentees who are younger than I am and who are going through this process. And when it comes to either getting onto a journal or doing mock trial or doing different things, we have different cutie talk that we pick from to give like specific advice on how to do that and how to build up their confidence to really like force themselves into these positions of power, positions of recognition. And yeah, we also work with the the admissions team to try to encourage more people to actually get access into this space. And I think year by year our numbers increasing, and it's still like a very slow process, but there's some changes being made, which it's really nice to see.
So I will admit, I have not been able to participate much with the student groups on my campus. And I think it's because of a couple reasons that I kind of want to bring back to previous questions. One is the pandemic and the fact that, you know, class right now is all remote and we're not on campus. So I think it's a lot harder, and this is my first semester, so it's a lot harder to I don't know. I feel like if I were on campus more, I might be able to participate in student groups, or I'd have more of an interest in it. But I think the other is that I'm going part-time and I'm still working full-time, and I think there's something within that I definitely connect to my immigrant heritage, and that is that when I decided I wanted to take the LSAT and then go, you know, apply to law school, it was for all those things I mentioned before, but I feel like my imposter syndrome started then. Like I would be in rooms, I'd be in policy rooms or advocacy rooms, and just like people would switch and you would hear them go into like legal language, or people with law degrees, like they'd be able to talk to each other in a certain way where I would just get kind of lost. And so I actually started studying for the LSAT secretly. I would study after work and on the weekends, and I didn't tell anyone that I was studying. I think I told like 2 people, and I was like, let me just take a couple practice tests and see how I do. And then like, even when I took my test, I think I told my parents maybe like 3 days before, and they were like, oh my God, why didn't you tell me this? And I just didn't want to, I don't know. I didn't feel like I was like, there was just something in me that didn't feel confident enough to tell people I was studying for the LSAT, like really doing that. But I think, I don't know, I saw this quote going around during the height of not that the pandemic is over by any means, but during the height of, I would say, COVID in New York. And it was like, when you're a child of immigrants and the world, there's so much uncertainty in the world and the economy is bad, essentially like you feel like this need to like produce and produce and produce and produce. And that's just like what you're told. And that like really hit home for me. I think that when, you know, just a little bit about my background, like my parents were both the first generation to go to college. My mom came from a very poor working class background, and my dad was the most successful of his siblings. And most of our family resources went back to support my family in Thailand, who didn't have much of a social safety net. And, you know, my parents didn't save for my college. And if they perhaps listen to this sometime, like I do not in any way hold that against them. And I fully support where their resources went. And similar to Ellen, I think my father experienced a lot of workplace racism because of his accent, because he was an immigrant. And that's really frustrating. But I think for me, like because I have basically kind of been on my own since I left home, my social safety net was always me. So I was like, I'd been out of school for a while. I didn't really feel like I wanted to take on the kind of debt that is associated with law school. So I was only looking for part-time programs, and I wanted to stay in the city and keep working. And I think, fortunately, I did fine on the LSAT, and then I got into a couple schools in the city that are part-time programs in CUNY. Quite honestly, the biggest incentive was because it's a public school and the cost, but I'm so glad that I ended up there, because I almost feel like I don't have to be in an affinity group to have conversations about critical race theory and about structural oppression, because it's a 100% public interest focused school. It is a public school, and most of my peers are, I think my classmates are majority people of color, over 50% women. I think around 10% identify as trans or gender nonconforming. And because I'm in the evening program, there's a lot of people who are also working.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that hit on so many relatable levels, like both for those of us who are here tonight and also for everyone who watches this afterwards, because I think especially with those who have immigrant parents and Asians just kind of as a whole, we have our own stereotypes and our own pressures, either from real family or from external expectations. And just the reality is that not that many of us came from a socioeconomic background where you could just write a $75,000 check for tuition and cost of living and then just roll the dice to see if you can make it happen in the public interest world afterwards and accomplish these goals that are noble and you're passionate about and capable of accomplishing. And so I think that's such an awesome and powerful kind of story for you to share with everyone. And I think on that note, I kind of wanted to ask our three L's, AK and Ellen, like what the schools are doing or could do better to really kind of capture all of those layers of nuance that come with being Asian. And then like that doesn't even start to touch the intersectionality with LGBTQ identity. So there are so many things to unpack on an individual level that are not just, study hard, do the 2L OCI interviews and go to the big law firm or go to the mid-sized law firm or become a prosecutor, all of these really pre-cut packaged paths through law school. They don't quite apply to us, or if they do, they're just harder and not as accessible. So I'd love to hear what your schools are doing well or what they could do better to make things better for the 2Ls and 1Ls and the incoming law students to support them and kind of grasp all of that individuality that comes with being an intersectional student. AK, do you mind leading us off?
Okay, I was already unmuted. Yeah, so I think that, APILSA at UCLA is pretty big. I think it's the biggest affinity organization on campus, and generally we also have a salsa group and like different offshoot groups that all kind of work together to do POC student organizing. I think that the school is generally facially supportive of all of the identity organizations, and especially with regard to APILSA, there I think is a difference in response when like for example, when APILSA writes a letter to the administration complaining about, we had a professor whose name is Stephen Bainbridge who accused an international student of giving him COVID earlier this year in the beginning of the pandemic, which is ridiculous. And so there was pushback from the students, and the administration was very, very apologetic and didn't do anything. There were no repercussions. The accountability measures need to be bolstered. There's not much in the way of faculty accountability once they have tenure. So I think that like having something in place to make sure that faculty can't say these really inappropriate things in the classroom or to students and just get away with it with no more than a slap on the wrist, essentially. But even then, the administration's response to APILSA was much stronger than their response to to BULSA or NALSA, other student organizations where other professors have said really terrible things too. We have one First Amendment scholar, Professor Eugene Volokh, who repeatedly doubles down on his right to say the N-word in class and on his online platforms. And when that happens and BULSA or NALSA kind of writes a student petition to the administration signed by many other of our peers, the administration is not as explicit in their in not accepting that kind of behavior from faculty. So overall, I think that there needs to be a better accountability for faculty more generally, but there is also a disparate application of what the dean will and won't say, depending on what org is asking. That was, yeah, putting putting some names on blast, but that's fine, right?
Yeah, no, I hope I responded with my face enough. I don't know what that was. No, that's really, that's good advice, good critique, and it's good feedback. They should hear it because those are real things that happen. So that's helpful for sharing. Ellen, take it away for us, please.
So I think about, places where students of color or queer students can get support, and I think it kind of, like, in organized ways, and for me it falls into the buckets of like affinity orgs, the law school administration, and then outside groups like bar associations, or just specific things that exist in the place you're at. Usually there's more of them in cities, but so I think it's tricky, because I think even with affinity groups, you can be a member of multiple affinity groups, right? Like, I sat on the e-boards of Outlaw and Apolsa when I was a 2L, but I think, like, for me, I think one thing that's very sad is that, I don't know, I can only speak about my school, but that Apolsa and LALSA and BOLSA and MASALSA and just like all these different affinity groups haven't necessarily historically worked together. And I think some of that is tied up in these fraught things of like, what even is Asian? Like, cool, it's a group of people that all come from one continent, but that's gigantic. Like, and we're not united necessarily by language or country of national origin or like anything. And also like the fact that Asian is sometimes this shorthand, we mean East Asian. And then there's like this other fraught thing of East Asians and their proximity to whiteness, and sometimes other affinity groups mistrust of folks in Apolsa. And so I think that these are all things that we're working against, right? Like, big level in the world, that I think you see it play out also at law schools. And I think even, I think this year there's an affinity group coalition or something at my school, but there's been some infighting. I'm not gonna like spill all the tea, but it's hard, I think, because there's a lot of deep racial hurts that are not transcended. And I think there's difficulty, right? There is power when it works, but I think also it involves a lot of needing to sit and listen. I went off on a tangent there, but I also, okay. So then we have like we have the law school administration, right? And I agree with AK, there's just, once a professor gets tenure, it's like, it's impossible to get rid of them, no matter what they do to single out, queer students or Black students or other students of color and make them feel unsafe and unwelcome. And I will say that, I've met so many amazing professors, and I would say that almost everyone, at BU Law is concerned about the students. And there have been really, really amazing faculty members who show up for students and who fight for us. But there are also, the faculty members who voted down a really famous queer scholars, job application, and they said that their work wasn't scholarly enough because it was gay. And I'm like, come on, So I think it's rough because there are so many good people and people who care and are trying. But I think that there's also a lot of inertia because just like, judges with lifetime appointments, sometimes once people get seated and get comfortable, they're very unwilling to change. I'm rambling, but my last thing, so the outside of law school support, in Boston, we have a lot of different affinity bar associations. The queer one is popping. Like, they're, even with the pandemic, we're still having Zoom social events, there's mentorship programs. Boston specifically, I think, acknowledging the segregated nature of this city, has a Boston Lawyers Group, which is a completely separate, like slightly before OCI diversity pipeline. So it's basically OCI, but for minority students. And that's awesome, you know, that exists and there's these things in place. So I guess if I had to sum it all up, I think that there's a lot of resources, but they don't always work together. And I think sometimes you can get one thing, maybe, you know, support from your affinity group. Maybe you have to look somewhere else, find one professor who is going to go fight for you. But I think it's hard because there's no like one place, one streamlined way where queer students or students of color, I think, can get everything they need.
Yeah, that's, I mean, in a literal sense, that's what an administration is supposed to do. They're supposed to administer the resources of the school. So that's great. I mean, great feedback, and it's a good observation. And it's unfortunately something that I noticed when I was in law school. So I think it's a generic kind of universe academia issue. There's a lot of competing little fiefdoms. So that's helpful feedback. And I think we're coming up towards the end of our time, but I really wanted to ask all of you one last question, and I'll ask it and then give you a little bit of time to think about what your answer is. So I wanted to ask all of you, what is the one thing that you would tell an incoming law student or 1L or someone just starting their 2L, something that you wish you had known, either some good insight into or advice, or just some words of kind of encouragement, because it has been an absolute insane year in 2020. And so you've all really persevered through that, and you've obviously seen a lot. And you have not given up, and you will be graduates of law. You will have law degrees in the next either 7 months or 3 years. So you stuck it out. So what do you wish that you had heard, because you didn't have an Asian and also LGBTQ mentor whenever you started law school? What do you wish that that person had told you, if they existed, when you talked to them when you were first starting out? That's what I want to hear. And so while I've asked that, I will just kind of mention, since Ellen touched on it, I really encourage all of you guys to join the LGBT Bar Association, also the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association. They both have national reaches, and they have people who are living in the kind of non-diverse, not as left-leaning places like me who live in Texas. So you can get like a vast array of people who do different practice areas, and also, or who do non-legal kind of policy work. If you join those, I really encourage it. It's a resource for those of us who survived before. And I think many of us, like you, I went to law school to try to pass the torch onward, and we're here to help. So with that, I guess, dead space that I filled up for 15 seconds, I wanted to ask you guys in reverse order, just kind of lead us out, starting with Maya and then going to Greg, Ellen, Chai, and AK. What is a thing that you would tell a younger version of you or a not younger version of you to do when they get to law school, or to know and to feel to stick it out when it gets crazy and tough?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm still trying to learn. But I think that two things that have been immensely helpful for me has been to like just really try to make sure I have a life outside of law school, because I mean, law school itself is so all-encompassing, and at the end of the day, we're like here to become lawyers, not to become law students. Like, that's not the end goal. And I think that it's been really easy for me to lose sight of that and get like kind of really stuck in kind of the, I don't know, the horse race of law school and that competition over like kind of the minutia. And I think along with that, something that's been really helpful to remember is that there isn't one way to do something. And I know that, you know, like I'm still hurting a little bit about journal selections, more so than I really wish I was, but I think it has been really easy for me to fall into the elitism that kind of, you know, defines in a lot of way both law school and the legal profession. And it's been really, really, really valuable for me to hear people kind of within, you know, the law school itself, as well as, you know, legal professionals who've been out for a while being like, it doesn't matter. There's so many different ways for you to do what you want to do. And I think kind of remembering that and trying to, you know, be in touch with why you came here in the first place. And remembering that there are a million different paths. And just because, like a grade may shut you off to clerking at the Supreme Court. It's like, do you really want to, given the makeup of the Supreme Court right now? No, but it's like, just because that happens, that doesn't mean that like you're not going to be an incredible lawyer, an incredible like advocate, or incredible at whatever it is that you choose to do. So yeah, those are the two things that I'm constantly trying to remind myself, because with Zoom School of Law, it is pretty easy to become all encompassed by law school.
So I think for me, I actually have a life outside of out of law school. So I wouldn't give that advice just because it was never a concern for me. But I think some people, they do need that reminder. But just thinking in terms of what I would have needed at the time, I think I should have been more, I should have reached out to my professors more. And I think the specific question I should have asked was, what do you think a good judicial opinion or a good memo would look like? And getting their feedback. Because I think I actually interned with a judge this past summer, and I think that really helped my writing. And I think it's that format that a lot of professors tend to look towards, because judges seem to be at the top of the legal system. So I think that would be my first piece of advice. Like, when it comes to just studying, it's really about what kind of writing they're looking for at the end. And I think as for a second piece of advice, it would be to talk to a few upperclassmen and just asking them about what are the different opportunities there are for me as a professional, and just sampling a few of them just to get a few different perspectives, because every law school is different in how they structure, how they get into journals, how they get into competition teams. And some of them have successes, some of them have not. And I think just trying to do a very quick survey with maybe like 4 of them would have been incredibly helpful with understanding how my school worked and tips for how I could succeed at my school.
So I'm gonna just shameless self promo here real quick, but I run an Instagram called like @EllenDrawsLaws, and I drew a comic about advice that I had my friends, what they would tell their 1L selves. And so I'm gonna give 2 of them real quick. But so I started as a 1L the same year our dean did. Dean Onwachi Willig is the first Black woman to be dean of BU Law School. And she got up in front of us when we all came for orientation and just said, look left, look right, you all deserve to be here. And I think that each one of us arrives at believing that at a different point during law school. It definitely doesn't feel true, at least it didn't for me for a while. But I like to just repeat that periodically, I think, for other people's benefit. Like, you deserve to be here. It's not a mistake. And you have every right to be here as like the gunner who keeps just doing things completely wrong in con law. Like, you deserve to be here, I promise. And I think for me personally, is just the importance of being kind, right? Like, and maybe it's corny, but it's so true, because you come out of law school and you've learned to read some cases, and maybe you can write a memo. And you're gonna relearn all of this on the job. Like, you're gonna relearn everything for the bar in terms of substantive knowledge. A lot of it's not gonna be that useful to you. Like, you're going to have to relearn so much. And it never was about the cases. It was about learning to think, but I think one of the things that people forget is that one of the most important things you get from law school is this network of people, and not in the weird, like, transactional, how many LinkedIn connections do you have, but like, who's gonna show up for you when it matters? When one of you wants to be a judge someday, who's gonna, show up and say like, that is my person. Like, they're amazing. Like, I got my job because the summer associate said something nice about me to a hiring partner. I did not like just walk in and wow on my own. And so that would be my advice. Like, just forget about the cold calls. No one cares how you did in CivPro 5 years from now. Were you kind? How do people think about you? You know? So, like, just be kind.
So I would say it's great to hear all of this because I'm a first semester 1L, and sometimes I like don't really feel like a law school student yet. But I guess I would say to that point, to anybody considering it, you can do it. There's a lot of, I feel like it took me getting through midterms to finally kind of be like, okay, I think I'm doing this. There's a lot of kind of mystique, and yes, it's a very like strange elite language. In some of the older cases, you're like, why? Like, what are these words? But it's totally doable, and there is no one type of person who can or should be a lawyer. Like, anybody who wants to be a lawyer or go to law school can. And should. I'm very inspired by my classmates who, we had this one session, we had one class where it was like, because it's Zoom and we're all like, you know, I'm in my kitchen right now, and this is like where I am in class, where it was like, bring your friends to class day. And so it was like partners and friends and kids. And like, I have a lot of classmates who are working full time and have kids and are going to law school, and they're doing it. And it's just so inspiring. And then the other thing I would say is I'm not good at always doing this. I'm terrible at doing this, but when you can, try and just enjoy it, because like sometimes I read a case and I'm like, this is fascinating, like it's so interesting. But a lot of times you just feel like there's more and more and more and more and more. It can feel like you can be so overwhelmed because, you know, there's always more preparing you can do. There's always more analysis you can do. There's always more research you can do. There's always more briefing you can do. But that doesn't mean you like have to kill yourself doing it. So take care of yourself.
So I think that 1Ls tend to be a pretty nervous group just generally. And of course, if you're a cutie pug, that anxiety is, you know, compounded time and time over. I think the advice I would give to a young trans law student would be not to be as self-conscious as you are, as you think you need to be, as I was when I was in 1L, and not thinking that I would have like a community at school. I feel like there are so many people here who have your back and who came and did the work before you, and that's been the case for generations. I think that that's something that I would have liked to know, that like when I got to school, I would find like a super supportive group of queers that had my back and took care of me. Like I don't know if it's the same as every law school, but at least at UCLA, it's like it's very left leaning. It still has its problems, but it's progressive overall. For example, last January or so, I got top surgery, and my friends literally carried me through the rest of the semester. We planned our courses so that I would always have a really good friend in each class. So they would send me notes, help me with assignments, do all these things for me, and they would also literally carry my backpack like to and from classes and cart me around and bring me food, like plug in my chargers and clamber under the desks and stuff. So like you will find your people. Like it's really, really hard now during Zoom, and I think that sucks. But I think the biggest thing is trying to find your people as early as you can by like putting yourself out there, making those connections, because there are a lot of people who are of a similar mind to you and who have the same kind of values and ideals. And I think that like if you seek them out, like, and take the time to really get to know each other, it's incumbent upon you to take care of them and them to take care of you. And that's like how I think that me and a lot of my like queer peers got through law school, with kind of like our heads still on our shoulders a little bit. I mean, we're still a little chaotic, but like I think that like it would have been a much different experience if we didn't have each other there to support each other. I think that like professors are also on your side. There will be ones that suck, but there are others that will, even if they don't understand everything, will try and to listen to you. So don't feel like you are taking up their time inappropriately. Feel like you are entitled to their time. Go to office hours. I didn't go to office hours because I was like, I don't know the material well enough to take up your time and waste it. But no, like, you're paying for law school, you're here for a reason. And even if you don't know anything, go to them and talk to them, because other classmates are doing that. They feel entitled to professors' time because that's their background or how they're raised, things like that. Like, take up space in a way that you don't think that you're able to is probably the biggest thing I would say. Another point is I think that I would advise a young Kiribati to be inspired by your predecessors, the people who came before you, and try to leave the school a better place. And think about like your own big picture about what kind of legacy that you can leave. You know, change conventions on journals, use singular they them pronouns. You know, understand the politics of citing and like sponsor like different academics whose work like actually advances LGBTQ rights and things like that. Try to leave the law school a better place than it was when you came into it in the first place. I think those are my two big things. So I'm handing it back to Heaven.
Yeah, those are all really, really, really great notes. I've been inspired just by listening to all of you, getting to know all of you, and I'm really happy that this is being recorded to pass on this knowledge and these experiences that you've all shared over the past hour and change. So thank you so much for being open, for talking, for creating a path, and like leaving a little bit, like AK said, of a little bit of a legacy behind you for future intersectional attorneys, both Asian and for all other members of the LGBT bar who will see this in the future years to come. So with that, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And please, let's all keep in touch. Good night, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.